Well, welcome everybody to Latinx Arts Mentorship in the Valley. We're thrilled to have our moderator and panelists here. I'm just going to do a quick introduction to Valley Arts Mentors in general. I'm Jonathan Miran. I'm with Valley Arts Mentors, and I also work with PT Theater Company. And the mission of Valley Arts Mentors is to leverage mentorship to strengthen the arts ecosystem in the Valley. And so far, we're actually a partnership between PT Theater, Holyoke Media, and Big Brothers Big Sisters Franklin County. And that partnership was really initiated in part through the Community Foundation and funding from the Community Foundation. We've also received support from Mass Humanities and the Mass Cultural Council through various local cultural councils. So we're grateful for all of that for giving us a start. The main thing we've done so far is pair early career artists with more experienced artists in the Valley. And we're sort of wrapping up our first cohort of that. And we're looking towards starting a new cohort. And you can find out more about that at artsmentors.org. But we've also started a webinar series. And so far, the webinars have been more oriented towards sort of the hows of being an early career artist, but we're really thrilled to step back and look at mentorship in the arts through the lens of four experienced Latinx artists from the Valley. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Jason R. Montgomery. I'm just going to pull up his bio. He is a Chicano indigenous Californian art activist, writer, painter, and playwright from El Centro, California. He's the co-founder of the police transformation group A Knee Is Not Enough in East Hampton, Mass. In 2016, he founded the arts activism collective Attack Bear Press. Jason's work has appeared in Split Lip Magazine, Storm Cellar, Illinois Review, and other publications. And in 2021, Jason was selected as one of two poets laureate for East Hampton for 2021 to 2023. So it's been really fun getting to know Jason and working with him on putting this together. And without further ado, a warm welcome, as warm as we can be over Zoom, for Jason Montgomery.
Auka, hola, hello. I am Jason Montgomery from Attack Bear Press. Tonight looks to be a lot of fun. There are some amazing artists here to talk about their practice, talk about their work, and talk about the partnerships and relationships they've formed throughout their time as arts professionals. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce everyone, and then we're going to jump right into some hopefully fun conversation. First up is Dr. Deanna Alvarez, singer, songwriter, poet, composer, filmmaker, educator, and scholar. Next, we have Vic Caseda, interdisciplinary artist, followed by Liz Rodriguez, a ceramics artist and founder of East Hampton Clay, and Johan Rashi Vega, multimedia artist and host of Radio Plasma. Thank you all for coming out tonight. We really appreciate taking the time out of your day to talk to us.
Thank you for having us, Jason.
So I'd love to actually hear from each of you a little bit about who you are, what you do. Let's start off with Diana. I'd love to hear more.
Oh, what do I do? For many years, I circumnavigated creating songs. And so in that time, it wasn't a waste of time, but I did other things like write poetry, and I started making videos. And then eventually, when I was honest with myself that I was a songwriter, then I had so many forms of practice that I decided to house them in multimedia performance. So I created a piece, which is a grief ritual of my own making. It's called Quiero Volver, a Chicanx ritual opera. And it is an ongoing project where, for me, I create a space where the stage is an altar to queer and trans artists of color. And I did this because in my scholarship, I kept in every art class that I was privileged to be a part of, I was they were not privileged to see artists of color in their syllabi, and it was really astounding to me in the most elite. It's not really astounding, but at these elite institutions, right? Not finding artists like me or artists that are part of my queer and trans artist community, and specifically Black, Indigenous, people of color artists. So I decided to focus my scholarship and my work on the liberation and coalition building of artists. It's really important for me as a Chicanx artist to have something in my lineage that opens the doors for us as family. So for artists of color as family, though I could certainly focus on my own Chicanx identity and history. It's really important for me to be like, no, I'm gonna be the tia that opens the door to our community across identity.
That's really wonderful. And Deanna performs regularly around this community, the community I'm sitting in right now in East Hampton, and it's always a pleasure. Next, I'd love to hear from Vic.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for having me on here. I'm currently where I'm sitting right now, looking out the window is I live in Northampton, and I just briefly want to talk about, give a Latin acknowledgement to the Nipmuc and Pecumtuck tribes who lived on this land. And actually not so far from here, there is a oxbow, and in the oxbow, which many of us probably know who are in the room, there was a hunting, this was a hunting ground for the Nipmuc and Pecumtuck. So it's probably within like half a mile. So, histories are still strong and alive in the area. So, I'd like to sort of like move on to my own art practice. I am a Latinx, Indigenous, non-binary, trans artist. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, actually, right where United States and Mexico's border converge. Like literally, like I could look out the back door and I could see the border highway and the fence. So my family's home lay directly adjacent to Juarez, and you could see the massive steel fence. You could see, this steel barrier that actually was that severed like this land and people from the back door of my mom's childhood home. Like sometimes we would be playing, and you could see like these dust trails along the dike, and they almost look like specters. And I mean, we knew what they were, though. They were the border highway. It was along the border highway. So it was the border agents who were traveling along in their vehicles, and you could just see like the remnants of how they had been there, and sort of just that like kind of like visual is very haunting. And my grandmother, who narrated a lot of the stories and sort of like introduced us to that space based off of her knowledge and experience. There were many things that she told us. When she said, you should never run around them. You should never run around the border patrols. And, and was very adamant on saying that you should pronounce, you should say you were American. And something else that she did is she talked about, there's this phrase that she always used, is she said basically that the borders, they didn't cross the borders crossed them. And it was actually entirely true of this region. Is just a minute, my dog is doing some stuff. Hey, go lay down. So so this is like, with this scene in mind, this is sort of the stuff, this is what inspires me to create work, is to talk about a narrative about life along the US-Mexico border, and also thinking about how, the exclusionary practices of the US government, and also just how other people, you know, who come to this nation. You know, there's a lot of like political issues around like who is seen as like legal or by the standards as illegal, which you know, is as undocumented. So a lot of this stuff resonates within my work, but simultaneously there is also these ideas that I sort of balance this like these dominant narratives, and it's looking back at like Mexica indigenous histories and sort of the value system, and also thinking about how they looked at gender and sexuality, and through like history books that were actually taken from that were written by indigenous people. There's a way that they've conveyed that there was not a hierarchy on like gender and sexuality. Actually, it was very open and free. So I look back at some of these ideologies and I sort of put them into my work. So I have a lot of sort of tension that's operating, and that's basically my work.
Thank you so much, Vic. I find your work to be fascinating and beautiful, particularly because I too come from a trans-border community. You know, you'd look out grandma's window and there was the border wall coming up. You know, when I was growing up, it actually wasn't in our community in the same way that it was along the Texas border. And you were told, like, don't go too far down the canal. And I didn't know until years later, it's because that's where the border was. You know, if you walk too far one direction, there you were. And so seeing your work, it's always so impressive. And in fact, that the ceramic that you did recently with the TV antenna and the plant, that piece, I think, is so beautifully encapsulates that strange conflict that exists there between the old and the new, and the kind of metamorphosis that comes from it. So thank you so much. Your work is just amazing. So, which leads us to Liz. Hi, how are you tonight, Liz?
And how are you?
I'm doing well.
I've had more than the pleasure of seeing Vic's work come together in person through the community, through East Hampton Clay. And I'm just like so proud to have had Vic in our community. I have kind of I run this community now. And so I was born to Puerto Rican parents in Brooklyn, New York. And I have this Nuyorican experience until I was 17 years old, and then kind of moved a little bit around the country, Chicago, and then spent the last almost 30 years here in Massachusetts, primarily in Boston. And I came to the Valley about a little over 3 years ago in 2018. And I wanted to start a community immediately. And primarily my focus was, to provide this kind of sanctuary for people to feel safe and to be in a space that's creative and supportive. So really that's kind of my focus these days. I was a full-time artist. I went to school for art, and I've been a full-time artist since I left the corporate world in 2010. And I loved being an artist and I loved making work, but I feel like this part of my life is far more creative than I've ever been in this space where I'm learning about the community, what it really means to be a Puerto Rican woman leading this community. That's, so I'm learning a lot about everything, I think, primarily myself. And in that, we've realized that we wanted to bring more diversity into our community. So we've been implementing programs to do that. So as an artist, I'm kind of putting that aside for right now until this community really develops fully and kind of functions on its own. And then my hope is to kind of go back to that. And maybe my work was primarily functional ceramic, and I made a lot of it. The last big thing I did was for the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And it was in conjunction with the Matisse exhibit. And after that, I realized I really wanted to be a teacher. And that was how the community started, was I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to provide a really sweet creative space. And it's just kind of exploded into this community where we now have about 300 people or so rolling through the space every week. And it's just kind of mind-blowing. And I'm in the process of developing everything that entails, and carefully looking at how we are in East Hampton, and how we present in East Hampton, and how we who we are. Really, that's really what we're in the process of developing, is who we are as a community. So, and that's been my primary focus right now.
Thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. We're actually neighbors. You're right across the hall from our studio. I've had the pleasure of working in your studio and working side by side. You are an incredible artist, an incredible community maker. And tonight I am drinking my water out of one of your students' mugs. So this is one from Hadley. So shout out to Hadley. We love your stuff. So
Thank you.
So, Johan, welcome. I hope you can hear me.
I think he's on mute. Is he on mute?
Well, I think.
Thank you so much. And I think you can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Okay. Such an honor to be sharing the space today with such amazing, beautiful people here. And in my case, I am originally from Mexico City, born and raised, and then relocated, self-exiled into the colonial world, first living in Puerto Rico for 12 years. And then exactly 10 years ago, I moved to Massachusetts on September 30 of 2011. So it's just a few days since I turned 10 years in Massachusetts. And as an immigrant, is this constant everyday challenge and mission of having to justify why you are here, having to validate that you are worth of being here. At first, there's a challenge, it's a struggle, it's painful. But then when you start getting used to it and you start owning it and feel proud of being here and accomplish staying here, that becomes your flag. The way to say, here I am, here we are. And the mission now becomes to make things that are relevant and important for the community. In my case, I am doing multiple things. In the artist side of myself, I'm a musician and a creative. And also I do media work. And this goes from creative media, multimedia work, and also even going into journalism. So combining all of this makes telling stories in a way that involves technology and involves the way you will create music, but with different elements. So it's been a combination of playing with all these different layers of sounds and images and textures and ideas and feelings to get to work with people, getting to know and learn from people, and how to transform those experiences, those feelings into pieces that can be a musical piece, that could be a picture, that it could be a short film, that it could be even documenting the experiences or the work of others, as I have had the honor and pleasure of doing it, capturing the music by Doctora Deanna Alvarez, by having deep conversations with Deanna and Jason, talking about identity when we were sharing our experiences as someone who is an immigrant from Mexico City, as someone as an indigenous, and as a Chicanx, and how different experiences can also be so similar. And to get to know and learn from each other has becoming possibly one of the most beautiful and rich experiences I personally have, in order to continue creating work and to absorb, learn, and then give back somehow. With this, I also do a lot of educational work as well. So I work with youth, teaching them anything related to what I do: music creation, media production, and for them to find their voice, their creative self, so that way they can do whatever they want and use this as a way to self-advocate, to be themselves, to share all the beauty that there is inside their souls, their minds, their hearts, and that is most needed right now. Because without art and without the unity that is bringing us together today, there is no purpose, there is no reason for being here alive.
Thank you. And it's funny, Johan, because you and I have partnered on quite a few projects over the years, from the Ofrenda to, House Poems, to me just calling you up and begging you to cover something for me. But it's funny to hear you say you feel like you need to justify, because you are everywhere I want to be. Just everywhere I want to be. You're in all of these spaces, and you play such a vital role in the community, and I truly tip my hat to you. I say hello to your flag every time I drive down Main Street in Holyoke. So it's my sons were like, "Who are you talking to?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm talking to Johan." So you're everywhere we want to be. So I sent out some questions around to everyone a little bit earlier today, and to kind of talk about, or to kind of point us in a direction tonight with this conversation. But one of the things that I noticed right off the bat is there are a lot of terms being used to talk about us as a group of people: Chicano, Chicanx, Indigenous, Latinx, Latine. I'd kind of like to hear everyone's thoughts about it, because we are a shockingly diverse group that gets homogenized very, very easily. So I'd love to hear from people.
I'll start by saying that when I was growing up, my family still, like, we just call each other Mexicans, and it wasn't until I moved to the Northeast that it was like, and I also didn't have my identity understanding, like my identity formulated then in my early, my late teens and early 20s, but it wasn't until I moved to the Northeast that I felt the need to tell people, like, oh no, I'm Mexican American. And then that whole conversation, and then it was in learning more about my ancestry that I felt really at home with the term Chicana and Chicanx. And I think an interesting part of it is, like, how much we know about our ancestry, and how much I think Vic used the word severed when speaking about land. I think there's a lot of there is a lot of our, at least my ancestry, that's severed with unjust death and early death. And this is just what it's true for people of color, and then especially true for queer and trans people of color. So that's where, like, the question of family, like identity, has to do with family, like how we relate to other people. I also will say that I find it very inspiring to know fellow artists who are Mexican and Chicanx identified who claim their indigenous ancestry. And I know that I have indigenous and African ancestry. I think that for the longest time, it was not clear that I had a right to claim those things. So I think in listening to one another and listening to the way we claim these things that's a mentorship piece, is we learn like, oh no, I can claim this aspect of myself that has been subjugated for a long time. For me, Chicanx holds indigenous, holds genderqueer, holds the rifts, the pain as well as the joy of the Mexican ancestral experience that I have, and it doesn't feel clear cut in any way. It feels like a kind of like a very rocky terrain rather than a clear box or clear identity.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from other people, because I find the idea of a solidification or a kind of an expression of these things feeling necessary in the Valley, in this community, which purports itself to be so progressive and open and all of these things. Because I know I personally have felt the same thing.
Hi, Jason. I'd like to, I think that thinking about identity can be a slippery slope, but I think that it's obviously too very important because of representation, right? I think that because people have been oppressed for so long, it's important to be able to talk about your experience and how you identify. Lately, I just was filling out an application yesterday. And this also kind of happened before. It happened when I had an interview there was a woman, Kate McQuaid from the Boston Globe. She asked me about my identity, and I talked to her about, I identify as Indigenous and Indigenous Latinx, and she called me back, and I can't recall what I was doing, but I couldn't get back to her immediately. And she asked me what tribe, and I thought about it, and I kind of felt like it really had I had a visceral reaction to that, because I couldn't give her a tribe. But I can tell you for all the reasons why I claim it, because there's like a dialect between my mom and her mother that I have no idea what they're talking about, and they occasionally will give me clues to what these words are saying that aren't English or Spanish. So that's there. And not to mention, though, is that if you think about settler colonialism, which is basically when a group of people, European people, come into other native inhabitants' land, they basically are invested in the erasure and dispossession of land. So if you think about what dispossession means, it means to divorce somebody of identity and land and spirituality. So you can sort of see the levels of how both, I don't even really think it's many people who are dispossessed from their identities, and there is just a long history of this violence through assimilation too. So it's like, the further you move along, the further it's harder for you to say, oh, this is pinpointing like my direct correlation to indigeneity. So I feel perplexed. I'm like, I feel when I claim it, I feel like it's taking away from the Native American experience, and perhaps even like making it a little bit harder for Native Americans to claim indigeneity. But the definition of indigeneity is one who was here, one who was originally from the land, right? And that is what my family is. So it's like, I think the word indigenous is like really loaded, but I also can see like the need to as a political act to do that, to claim it, because it's in fact true.
And I fundamentally agree with you. It's very complicated. And I mean, if you even just look at my people, you know, the border directly divided the Kumeyaay Nation between the North and the South, and the North receiving recognition as a federally recognized tribe, but Southern Kumeyaay in Mexico have no recognition by the United States government. So to be an indigenous person from that area carries such a weird double standard, culturally, religiously, personally. You feel deeply tied to this, but then legally and in a culture that is colonial, you're divorced of it. It's a really strange thing, and I thank you very much for bringing it up.
And I just want to add to that, as my mom grew up in Chicago. She was born in Puerto Rico, and she came to stateside when she was 4 years old, and was discriminated against pretty heavily as a Puerto Rican girl, and was beat up and chased down. And so by the time she met my dad and moved to New York in the 60s, and so I grew up with a bit of, I can't say outwardly shame, but there was some shame around being, or maybe shame or fear around being Latin. Like, she spent a lot of her time correcting my Brooklyn accent. She spent a lot of time, making sure that I was going to survive and be okay in this world. And so a lot of this identity, my stepfather was Italian. So from the time I was 6 years old, it was almost like that part of my identity was erased. And it's only in my adulthood that I've been able to kind of reclaim it and feel safe in reclaiming that identity as a Latin person. So I'm still really learning what it means, and what does it mean to have this brown skin and if you look at photos of even in my own community, I am the brown skinned person in my community. And so I'm really just learning, not only through this discussion and through discussions that I've had with Vic in the past, and what that really means. And I have done DNA testing, and there is a huge percentage of my DNA that is indigenous. Of course, there, and African, and I think, like Dr. Deanna said, it's a kind of a rocky road in the beginning, right? It's not kind of straightforward. There is some grieving that has to go on with that, right? Because there was a bit of a lost identity in the beginning of my life to now. And as East Hampton Clay develops, that's really what is developing. Who am I as a leader, and who are we as a people? And how do we, and who am I, right, as a Latin leader, Latinx leader, and how do we move forward and be really inclusive and celebrate these differences and in all of us. But at any rate, so I'm just in the process of reclaiming that and grieving that I didn't have that so much in my young childhood.
Beautiful. It really seems as though there is an aspect of being Latinx that is a process of discovery, and personally, I think it comes from the multiple colonizations that all of us have endured. I mean, depending on where you were located, it definitely was Spain, but it also then could have been like with my people, Mexico as an independent nation, and then the United States, and briefly France. All strange things, but I'd love to. I'd love to say hello to Rosemary, because Rosemary is on the line, and I just want to give respect where respect is due. But I'd also love to hear Johan's take on it.
This is a really complicated topic, and I echo what I've heard in previous comments about this is a discovery process. As we are all going through a journey in this life, this discovery of self-identity is part of this journey. And that is why using different ways to identify yourself as your origins, your roots, your feelings, it's a combination of all of them. And I think all of them are valid and genuine and validated, and they should be enforced and respected. However, at the same time, this is problematic because for each one of us, this is true. This is our journey. This is our self-discovery experience. Unfortunately, for the ones who hold power and prefer to be comfortable being ignorant, this is something really convenient to them, because by just applying those labels, they feel that they checked all the marks that there are to do, and I'm being inclusive, and I'm being fair, and I'm acknowledging everyone without actually taking the minimal effort to learn and understand where those identities come from. Because this is something that has to do with a generational experience, that has to do with where are your roots and where are you physically located. And while for some people to use the term Latinx may feel something unnecessary because they are clear on their understanding where they are from and who they are, for others who are dealing with understanding that struggle between where I am and where I come from, that is essential for them to know who they are. So it is important that people who are using and honoring the labels or the ways people need to be recognized and identified by, do their due diligence on understanding why this is being utilized, and not just to say, well, I'm going to say Latinx and I'm being inclusive and I don't have to do any homework on understanding why that is important, without even understanding that for some people, from some places and from some generations, actually to use Latinx may even be offensive. And that needs to be honored and respected the same way it has to be done for who needs to be acknowledged as a Latinx because of roots, identity, and by identity, I mean all the different needs for identity and recognition of who this person is. So that is why it's complex, because for many of us, it is clear that it means a lot of things, and it's a work in progress. And those ways to identify ourselves may change, maybe tomorrow, because now after this conversation, we found out something new about ourselves. But for who is using it just because it's trendy or because it's cool or because it's what everybody else is doing and I don't want to feel outcasted, it is important that the education and learning and understanding the need for this purpose of identification and ownership of who you are, it is done in a deep way. And that is, I guess, a little bit answering the question that Rosemary was placing on the chat about how can we put together the communities from the African-American roots and the Latino or Latinx roots, because they are so interconnected, but because of colonialism and power, it was intentionally made in a divided way. So someone who is Latinx apparently cannot be also identified as Black or as an African descendant, where as community and someone who lived in Puerto Rico knows that being Latino and being African is part of the same identity. And it's not that hard to understand, but apparently for many people, it is hard to accept. So it's a lot of education to do in order to be able to use properly and with honor those different ways people are asking and needing to be identified by.
Thank you, Johan. That was really beautiful. Thank you so much. You know, I think you brought us kind of into our next place, which takes this kind of larger scale and brings it down a little more personally, because I'd love to hear from each and every one of you of how you translate this journey and translate your own identity into your personal style with your work. So feel free. I'd love to hear from everyone. It's hard to tell who's going to go first on Zoom.
I'll just talk a little bit about my own personal work outside of the community. My grandmother died kind of unexpectedly in 2010. She fell down a flight of stairs, and she was a big influence in my life in that, you know, for many reasons, but we also called her the #1 bochichera of the block. I loved her so much. But as a result, I was really impacted by that loss. And I started to look at, I was helping my dad kind of, and my family actually, just kind of go through her things and figure out where things were going to go. And I was looking at textures and patterns and things that she had in her own, in her life. She used to love to do needlepoint and some other kind of fabric arts. And so I was really influenced by like a lot of the dotting that was in her work, in her life, and some of the rosettes and things like that. And I wanted to incorporate, as Americanized as I am, I wanted to incorporate some of the aspects of our identity, like red roses were really big to her. She used to have a lot of photos of the Spanish ladies with the fans and the big red roses. So I incorporated some red roses into my work. And some of the textures in her life also kind of found their way in my personal work as well. And it was actually just quite the beginning of my discovering some of those Puerto Rican roots and learning about her and the big family that she came from, and this warmth that I would imagine that among the fighting of big families, the warmth that also came with that. You know, they, as much as they fought amongst the siblings, all fought amongst themselves, they spent every moment that they possibly could together. They all lived within, you know, like a 5-block radius in Brooklyn, and there were like 19 of them, you know, and finding that that lovely history kind of buried under. She had dementia for much of her, probably for the last 30 years of her adult life, and so it was kind of like just rediscovering who she was. I knew her as a little kid, but I didn't really know her as an adult. And it was the beginning of discovering who my family was as well, really, in that space.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from everyone, but I just want to take a moment to, what you said deeply touched me. And just take a moment to recognize that I think for so many of us, our grandmothers, our abuelas, our nonas, our mamas are like played such a vital role. My grandmother's actually close to passing as we speak, and that human shaped, I think, not just me, but every one of my siblings, every one of my cousins. She's really been the center of my personal growth and development. So I'd love to just dedicate this night to Emily Alacon, and thank you. So, but I'd like to get sorry, I'm gonna get a little choked up. Love to hear from someone else. Or we can move on to the next question.
We can do that.
Okay, so I would like to hear about what kind of drew everyone into this field. I mean, you know, I come from an agricultural community. When I kind of told my family I was going to be an artist, my family was like, "Well, why don't you go paint the fence?" And so, kind of, what drew everyone here?
I think in my case, it was the need to constantly keep learning and keep enjoying of all beauty there is in the world. Something my dad taught me was to be always eager to keep learning, that the horizon is not the end of what you see, it's just the beginning of it. So you have to go towards it and keep finding out what is beyond there. So with that, I became always alert about what is around me in all aspects. What can I see? What can I hear and feel and treasure? And those memories or those emotions then become something that I can share in a different medium or in a different way, as a story, as a music piece, as picture, you name it. Anything that can capture a little bit of that essence of the moment or the experience of the place. And when this gets intersected with the human interaction with other people, so full of experiences and knowledge and wisdom and creativity, that's where the richness becomes infinite. Because it's this symbiotic back and forth, feeding each other on what is happening, what is being made, and is just magical to see. And from interacting with someone as it has happened, even in a remote way, as we did with Dr. Deanna Alvarez and myself, recording something for the Ofrenda de Muertos of last year. We did it on remotely, but we were able to put together a music piece as a homage that made a beautiful piece for the ofrenda. And that is the type of experiences that, even though we weren't able to do this crossover in person, but the essence of what it means and what it feels, and listening to Deanna's voice and performance, and trying to do the most seamless way to play along with her as if she's playing next to me, is what made this piece to become what it happened for the ofrenda. And that is, I mean, one of many different examples of experiences that happen in that way. So I think in my case is to be present and to be open with all my senses, to be able to capture and then to see what happens from there, being able to create something out of what is happening at a specific time and place.
Beautiful. What about you, Diana? We haven't heard from you in a while.
Well, I think I like the last question better, so I'm going to mush this one with the last one. They're kind of like similar answers. So it's like it actually is all very tied together for me, that like the driving force of why I create things is to process what I am learning from death. And I live a life that feels when I speak in some circles, it feels like very morbid, but it's just my life, is that most of my family has died. I have held multiple parents through to as they transitioned, and at this point in my life, I'm motherless times 3. The motherless, being motherless has been a real root of my existence, real understanding of like, how do I learn about myself when my origin point is missing? So my life has, and my art has really kind of circled around those things and continues to. And I think there's yearning, and there's grief, and there's rage, and all of these things are a part of why I create. There's definitely a like a through line of melancholy, I think. And what it turns to for me, what I try to keep reminding myself is what of a lot of what Johan was mentioning is like, death teaches me to be present. Death teaches me to understand that I cannot take things for granted. So what may come across as naive joy to some people is true experience with the fact that I can't bullshit. I have to enjoy my life. I have to be present with people. I need to understand that we need that symbiotic connection with each other, and that is essentially the highest form for me of what I can do, whether I'm creating a video or creating a song or performing, writing a poem. It is, how can I reach across the screen, or if we're in person, how can I reach across to you and have a moment of human connection, with the understanding that at any moment it can all go away. So for me, it is around processing. Death is what kind of draws me to art in many ways, and death and birth go hand in hand. There's grief and there's joy, and they coexist. And for me, it ends up being a place to show others that grief is not just not just like a well that you get lost in, that there are other things that coexist with the grief. And I think that's really, really important when we think about how we interact with younger artists and with fellow artists. We're in the middle of a major grief cycle with this pandemic, and it is so crucial that we care for each other collectively, that we ask how we're doing, that we let other people know that they matter in this world, that we check in with them, because part of the collective grief is a major mental health crisis, right? And it's even more immense for artists of color, for queer artists, queer and trans artists. So these are the things that drive me, is, when I think about like what's the reason for it, it all comes back to death, and that understanding that it pulls me to be present. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna stop talking because my cat's trying to knock down my laptop.
That is part of the reason that I came to do this panel at my studios, because my cat he is going through a real needy phase. And so I knew he would be on my lap. But you bring up a really interesting thing. And I hope that we have some younger artists, some emerging artists who are on this panel, watching this panel, hoping to hear that little tidbit from, some established people about how they do their work, how they create. And, we are going through this huge change, this dramatic shift. A lot of the work that I do is very public focused, and we just haven't been able to do it. So I'd love to hear about how people are structuring their time now, how you're creating. And Vic, I'd love to hear from you first.
I'd actually like to, I'm going to go back and then I'll come back into this.
Please.
I'll just sort of consolidate it, sort of like Diana did it. Is so I want to answer that question about like what made me sort of what was the driving force of making art. And I think one of them is like one, because there's an inherently I like to make. Like, I think if my experience growing up was like a cis white male that was privileged, I might make art about embalming animals. No digs to Damien Hirst, but real. But I think because of like where I was raised, the socio-political nature of where I was raised, also sort of my experience, my family was were very conservative religious people. And I think that there was a way that I grew up, and they were, you know, much like the experiences that I've heard, is my family, my mother and my father were in, not so much my father, but my mother, but who was sort of the matriarch. Strange dynamics. We don't need to get into that, but my mother was intent in assimilating us, and in some ways, there was a way she even didn't want us to speak Spanish or pronunciate Spanish words that, you know, I mean, I recognize Spanish is like a colonial language, but even that much, she said these words like in a very like English slash like I mean, it just seemed it wasn't right the way that she was saying these Spanish words, and this was her native dialect too, one of her native dialects. So like this like assimilation, this type of like discipline from a religion, and really was putting me in a box, and in the box that I was living in was beginning to become smaller. And I think that it really kind of just made me so small. And I mean, I was queer and non-binary, so it was just like in opposition to me. Like I really lived a very self-destructive life. And I think that through art, there's a way that I was able to, it was a series of unlearning. Like, it was a series of unlearning who I was. And I have this process where I look at history, and I really delve deep into history. I mean, there's not a lot of it, but there's still shards of history that kind of counter like the dominant narrative. So these are sort of the clues that I embed into my work. And my work is really interdisciplinary. I work with ceramics, video, sculpture, performance, I really think it's because at an early age, I learned to like be somebody, to perform somebody I wasn't. And it's sort of this, it's code switching is what it's called. So I learned to code switch. And I think that I've been able to do it for so long that this like thing like just seeps into my work. Like, it's the reason why I'm able to like manage so many mediums. But and so this is just like basically what happens in my process. But as far as what I'm doing right now and how I sort of manage my hours in my day and sort of keep myself accountable, it's actually, it's pretty, right now I'm applying for academic jobs, and that is a job in itself. I mean, many people say this, and you don't know it until you're actually like applying for jobs. And it's taken up so much of my bandwidth that I feel like I don't even have an art practice right now. Plus I'm teaching. So it just, I don't know. I haven't really established, I haven't established one yet, but I think that something that really does help me is like when I have a show, it makes me have to work towards the show. So that's like, that's real. That's real.
I really appreciate that. And I'd just like to circle back to something you said, this weird dynamic between assimilation, which I think was very much our parents and grandparents' generation, and versus unknowing. I know for me, for as much as my grandmother was very proud of her brown skin and very proud of where she came from, where my hometown, when you walk into a store, 99% of the time they start off speaking Spanish, whoever's there, and the clerk. And she would make this huge point about being like, no, you'll speak to me in English because I'm an American and that's what I do. And she spoke fluent Spanish, like she taught Spanish out at the high school. And it was always very strange to me to witness this thing happen with her. And now as an adult, I love that idea of part of the Latinx experience around mentorship is unlearning these things. So thank you for bringing that up. It's I think really important for people to hear. What about you, Liz? How do you manage your days? I see you buzzing through the halls, so I've got to know.
I need a lot of structure in my week because I process as with somebody with some executive function issues. And so as a result, I put a lot of people in place who are much more organized and structured. And I sit down with them throughout the week, either in a leadership meeting or a creative meeting, or so I have a lot of these things, and they help me kind of organize my thoughts because my thoughts whirl. I mean, there are so many people that that say, how do you, like they think it's a challenge for me to come up with ideas for the studio. And it's quite the opposite. I don't even know how to capture all of the thoughts that go through my brain. I could start 14 companies an hour, really. So really that's kind of how I structure it. I have a leadership meeting every Thursday with our admin and with our studio operations manager. I sit down with various artists in the community throughout the week, and then everything is centered around the 3 or 4 classes a week that I teach in the studio. So as far as my creative process goes, there was, when I was creating work, there was 2 weeks of utter chaos, right? I was just creating and it was messy and it was insane. And then there was the glazing period. And while everything was in the fire, I would reorganize my studio and start the destruction process all over again the following week. So it was this kind of ebb and flow. And I find the creative process to be very messy, and happily so. It is a very messy, you're experimenting, you're moving physically through space, and then kind of an organization process. That's how I usually do it. But in my business, I just kind of keep as organized as I possibly can. So
Interesting. I'd love to hear from you, Johan, too. Like, I see you all over the place. I mean, again, you're everywhere I want to be. So how do you manage now? How do you get through the days?
So at some point I used to be very well organized and structured, and then I realized that was gonna be the end of me because things change. Things are constantly changing. If there is any constant, it's chaos. And just listening, Liz, talking about how messy the process can be, and because that is being creative, it has to be messy.
mm-hmm.
For me, it's more than trying to make time, is to have the energy to create, because time sometimes may not be on your side, may be a complicated thing to handle, and sometimes it is already committed, especially when you have to fulfill responsibilities as your daily job demands of you. So time sometimes is not always available to you, but your energy, that's a totally different thing. And when that energy is there, usually what I do is whenever I have to face or deal with things that are frustrating and infuriating and the ones that usually bring us down because they are really tolling on us, especially as immigrants and people of color and Latinos, Latinx, I use all that negative energy and I recycle it. I found myself to be like a processing machine of making all that awful energy into something, I hope, beautiful. So that's where the energy comes in. I don't let it consume myself. I transform it into something that it can be given to someone who needs it, including the people who make me angry, because maybe they are more miserable than I am. So they need a little bit of love. So instead of giving them reasons to be angry, I'm going to give them something that maybe they will bring back a little bit of human essence to their lives. So that's what I do. I don't worry that much about time. Whenever the time is there, I use it, but I always make sure that I have the energy to continue creating. And sometimes projects that are messy are going to require that time to itself, but at the same time, that messiness is the reminder I need to make this chaos a beautiful thing, and I'm going to find out how, and it's going to happen, and eventually it happens because that energy is your drive, is what makes you go for it and to create and to not to fulfill anybody's desires or needs, but the ones that you have inside yourself. And that's when you know, I did something, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to feel good about it when I'm done.
Thank you. Deanna, I'd also love to hear from you. We talked a little bit before the webinar started about kind of the ebb and flow of busyness that comes with being an artist. How are you kind of dealing with where we're at right now?
Well, to be honest, I'm struggling with it. I have a lot of trouble with part of the reason that I was in school for so long is because I needed structure to get things done. And because it was funded. But now, I mean, I structure things. Okay, well, I would say the pandemic has caused some struggles around this, but I've also been very fortunate to have grant support here and there, you know, like different things come in and I feel like I've learned a little bit more about how to apply for grants, how to support myself as an artist. What I'm really working on is working smarter, not harder, because what Johan is talking about, the lack of energy and also having health issues to attend to, I just cannot. It's not sustainable for me to like take, you know, when I was first starting to perform, taking every little gig that was hardly paying me anything. And now I really, and I encourage young artists to do this too, I really encourage people to turn down things that are not that aren't nutrient dense. You know, that's how I feel. It's like, you know, you can't be everywhere and you're not needed everywhere, you know, but I what I'm looking for is connections that are meaningful, and performances and events, teaching things that are going to sustain me as an artist so that I can continue creating. And that's been a transitional process. I have a friend, a fellow queer Latinx musician who recently wrote that she got called unethical by an institution for charging for her work. And she's somebody who books at colleges often, right? And she's an established singer-songwriter, artist, you know, someone who I really admire and I follow, and I've performed with her, and I just think like here's an artist that who I admire, who I look to for inspiration, who's getting that pushback from institutions. And then, you know, even more so, I say that's why we have to really hold a hard line when it comes to clear, being transparent about pay, about our value as artists. And I say this firmly because, well, you know, I don't have the privilege to not. And also for younger artists, I think it's important anytime we value ourselves as artists, anytime we are choosing those nutrient dense events and places to be, we're making that more of a mainstream thing. We're making it more of a norm for our artist community, for fellow artists. So when I'm thinking about, for example, this artist, when she, you know, I'm sure she let them know that they were unethical, but I know that there's an ethics behind that. It's like, if I'm asking for a certain rate from an institution, it's not just because I need it. It's because I want other artists to be able to do the same. So anyway, that just goes back to, for me, that's like a big part of how I'm trying. That has a big influence on how I structure my time right now. And similar to what Vic said, it's difficult to, I'm applying for a lot of academic jobs as well, and doing multiple different projects. And it's, I actually, before this webinar, I was thinking, oh, wow, I need to really practice. And I think that that's a constant for artists, is that we always have to remind ourselves, maybe just in life, we always have to remind ourselves. And that's ritual, right? Like coming back. For me, it's going on hikes, and it's going journaling, you know, like just having a journal nearby, even sometimes just holding it, and then hopefully I'll get to the place where I write one sentence or one line in it. Or picking up my guitar, you know. I always tell my students, yes, it has to get messy, and the first step is just do it. Don't think about it being pretty or perfect or sounding good. Just do it. And if anything, just so that you can feel that you did it, feel in your body that you did the art that day, and then you keep collecting a little bit more every day. And I also think a big part of inspiration comes from when we reach out to each other. And actually, I have some emails due to a few of you here about a thing I'm organizing, and that's how it always ends up. It's like, it's exciting to hear from our fellow artists to say, oh, will you do this thing? Will you sing, what did you ask me to sing? La Llorona for the exhibit? You know, like moments like that, it keeps us moving. And that's, you know, that's what we need. We need our community.
And I think that's so very, very true. I don't think there's a person on this webinar that I have not bothered for something, that I've not come to and said like, hey, could you possibly do this? Or can I ask your advice on that? Or could you come and talk to these people? You know, partly because I come from a big family, and if I don't ask people for things, I get weird inside. But I think it's also something about just our community of artists. And but I would like to talk about one thing that you brought up, and that is the struggle. I know a lot of us are facing a weight right now. It's just that weight. Who are you going to? Who are you turning to in your lives to help you with these problems? It's not just personal, but also with your work. Who do you turn to? Liz could start us off.
Well, and when the pandemic hit, the first thing I did was reach out to other people who run pottery studios for inspiration, and we really leaned on each other a lot, figuring out what grants to go for. And what we were going to do about classes. Were we throwing them online? What were we doing? So really it's people who are kind of doing the same thing. Um, and just to name a few people, Molly Cantor up in Shelburne runs the Handle Factories. I think it's called the Community Clay Center at the Handle Factory. And she introduced me to Western Mass as a whole, and brought me here when I lived in Boston as an artist through the Asparagus Valley Pottery Trail. And I also reached out to some people that I worked with in Boston, like Kirsten Bashan of the Clay School, and then Lynn Gervins of Mudflat Pottery School, just to kind of see what they were doing and how, and everybody handled it differently, but it was really nice to have that support. And in my own work, it was really people who inspired me. I remember just like, and I say this to the people in my community, like, don't be afraid to reach out to somebody that you admire, because you never know what kind of response you're going to get. Very rarely did I get a response that said, you know, I can't talk to you right now, or I don't want to talk to you. Very rarely. People are always open about their process and their journey, how they found it. Because I remember sitting in my office as a business person in Boston, looking out my window going, how do I do this? How do people do this? Like, how do they make art and make a living at the same time, you know? So I always encourage people to reach out to people that they admire and just ask. And people will tell you, they will tell you, you know, where their funding comes from or how they did it every time. So that's
No, it's really interesting. You know, there's times I feel like the cold caller of the arts community, because I just pick up the phone and will ask anyone for anything. I think that's actually how we met in real life. Was I showed up at your door asking, show me how to do clay. And so I too would really encourage young artists to knock on doors. I mean, the worst thing that you probably will ever hear is I just don't have the bandwidth right now. But more often than not, I think most of us want to talk about what we do. You know, I know that Johan, you're another big community connector. Who do you go to?
I've been thinking about that, and I don't even know the answer, who I go to, but there is a reason for it. Because when I created Radio Plasma, it was in response to, at that moment, the lack of options for community to be able to tell their stories, to be able to be showcased, to be recognized, to be known, to actually become visible. So with the experience and the few resources that I had available at that moment, I felt that I could make this a tool that could provide something for the creative and artist community in the region, and to also start showing others how to start creating this independent media production and creative work at the same time on your own, that you don't need anymore to rely on big corporations or the big outlets to give you that little chance to be seen or heard once with their own narrative or conditions. So I felt that I needed to become a helpful resource for the community in that matter, because of what I know how to do. So I always thought of myself, in going back to my initial statement about that, I feel that I need to justify and to justify why I am here. Well, maybe that's a way. That's a way to become helpful to the creative community, and providing them with tools and with a space where their work can be amplified and put out, so we can have a way to share with each other about what we are doing. So that has become my main purpose, if I can put it that way, to be as independent as possible and self-reliant on what I have, not only for myself, but also to be able to help my fellow creatives on whatever it needs to be done in order to become successful as a community, especially when we are doing something as we are together right now, this evening, as creatives, that we identify ourselves as part of a community that not always has the support or has the visibility or the ways to get together as we are doing today. So that is important, because that could help for many more things to happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Because you truly are this amazing connector out in the community, showing people how to do these things, pulling these projects together. I know I've relied on you personally so often, too often, but thank you. And I'd love to hear a little bit from, both Dr. Deanna Alvarez and Vic, coming, from the more academic realm. Where would you turn? Who do you look to in those areas?
Well, I actually, so when I applied to the program here at UMass, I applied to work with a mentor, and that person is an interdisciplinary artist. So it really helped that they were working in multiple mediums and we had similar conversations. So it just worked out that, in the institutional space, they were able to guide me through that area. Plus they also have good politics, and it's important to kind of meet up with somebody who shares your similar politics, but also recognizes that these institutional spaces do not practice like are not like engaged in equitable practices for marginalized people. So this person really helped me out in that way. And so this person was my mentor several years ago, but however, we transitioned out of that relationship, and this person continues to be my mentor, but is also kind of family now. It's and like family, we've had like our ups and our downs, and we actually just were able to get through a really tough part of our mentor-mentee / friendship. And it's really helped me out in so many ways that I can't begin to tell you, but this is a relationship that I really value. But much of the relationships that I think that consist of mentee mentorship or in relation with people as sort of community, I generally tend to like bring them in. And what that is for me is like, I consider it to be like a queer kinship, because much of my friends are actually queer, and it's like non-traditional. It's not non-traditional bonds that, there's no blood bonds, there's no this urgency to like procreate. So it's people who are coming together because they have the similar experiences. So this is sort of where I kind of like center my mentor-mentee relationships, is like with the possibility to like evolve and become family, because it's like really important for me to sort of to have that kind of relationship, but also that commitment. It's like a lifelong commitment of like, yeah. So, I definitely feel inspired by mentee mentorship experiences. And actually, I haven't had a mentee relationship, and I think that it's probably time that I start looking for one, because I think that, similarly, so many opportunities, and really like, just like I've had a lot of opportunities that people have been really generous. And I think that I too can give back in that way, because, I feel like it's possible now.
I would love to see your mentee. I would love to see what that kind of relationship could produce. just partly because I'm a big fan of your work, but like I think the world needs more little Vicks running around.
Say that.
So I would love to hear from Diana about the same thing, but we have 2 minutes left on the webinar, and I want to really respect everyone's time. So I'm going to move to our final rapid fire question, and Diana can start us off. How do you know when a work is done?
That's the question? It's a rapid fire question?
It's a rapid fire question. This is a quick answer. How do you know when it's done?
It's a gut feeling for me. It's like I'm transported when I'm singing a song and I have allowed the mistake. Like I'm okay with, I have songs that like a characteristic chord change came from a mistake that my fingers just kept playing the wrong chord. And then I was like, oh, I'm keeping that. And so when I'm able to just like lean into the gut and the mess, and I feel transported when I'm singing it, that's how I know something's done.
What about you, Liz? How do you know when something's done?
In my art, it's when I've added one too many things. I always, people always say less is more, but I'm of the ilk that more is more. And sometimes it's just one too many things. And so I have to just pull something off and just let it be. And I also work intuitively like Deanna, and it's just kind of a gut thing too.
Johan, how do you know when something is done?
When I'm starting to ask too often what else to put on it or what else to do with it, that's the time for me, because it means, and it's something that I constantly tell my students about that. Make sure that you finish something, that you wrap it up, and you feel that that sense of accomplishment on something. And yes, it may not be the masterpiece you want to do, but it is one step towards that level of mastership that you want to reach. So you know you can revisit it, but knowing that you finished it, because that feeling of accomplishment is so necessary in order to move on into the next project. So I learned myself to do that, to let go and start over, knowing that whatever I left, maybe not yet finished on that last work, it will be the foundation for the next one. So that way the masterpiece will come eventually by itself.
Thank you. And finally, Vic, how do you know when something's done?
Jason, I feel like this is like a trap. Like, like when do I know something's done? Oh man, like, I mean, okay, so I mean, this kind of sounds weird, but I don't actually ever feel like an artwork is done. I don't, because I think that there's ways that I think about pieces that I've made, and I think over a course of time I continue to think about them, and I think about like how I would approach them as an artist now. And then for me, like sometimes that idea or the work that I made like transforms in my head, and I'm like, oh, I could work this thing, it would change, it changes. And then so I think about it as like, sure, there's an endpoint to the build, but also for me, in like conceptually, I always feel like I go back to my pieces of work. And I've been thinking about that too with the work now, is like there's one that I thought I finished, but I actually feel like I'm going to go back to it and continue a series of them. So yeah, this is this is just a short answer to something bigger. Yeah.
I think we could spend
trajectory of doneness.
I think we could spend 2 hours just talking about how do we know if a piece is ever completed. I never know also, mainly because so much of my work is just recycled from another piece I did. It's just torn apart junk that I've taken off of one thing and slapped on another. And But in that same way, this conversation is never done. I think it's a wonderful conversation, and I hope that we can keep having it. I want to thank Valley Arts Mentors for the opportunity to have this conversation, to get such an amazing panel together. The Community Foundation, Mass Humanities, and Mass Cultural Council, both as a larger organization and as the local cultural councils who supported this to make sure that all of our panelists' time is valued and paid for. So thank each and every one of you for coming together today and speaking with us. And we hope to speak with you again. And I know I'll be knocking at each and every one of your store asking for some help at some point. So
Looking
thank
forward.
you.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you all.